Hello, YouTube. I want to talk about what the facilities at UPS were like at the warehouse. For other people who are considering working there and those who just want to hear about it, it was a frequent thing to find that our water fountains were either hot or they were broken. Sometimes they were in pieces inside the building. We would have these large extendable rollers on wheels called casters that would sit on these things called roller stands that sat about 6 to 7 feet tall, and the stands would get bent by E-Reg trains in the building, hitting them as they passed down the aisles that ran in a circular route around the building and down the aisles between the rows of brown trucks that are positioned on either side of either bay door inside the building on pins. That's what they call them, pin loads, with the elevated platforms behind them. There were bits and pieces of broken things, bolts, nuts, batteries, you name it, stuck in the steel grates on the elevated surfaces, and the tracks that the E-Reg unload devices would drive down or be pushed down on the pins. The slides themselves were often filled with trash, and we had to have full-time housekeeping come through because damaged packages would leak out stuffing and filling material, and it would drop down onto pin 10 in the building that I worked on in the first area. There were these metal diverters that would push the packages off the top belts on the pin loads and cause them to drop at a certain position on the slide in rows, and then eventually it would just flood the entire slide before it backed up onto the top belt. People would go to use the bathroom, and the bottom floor bathrooms were usually terrible, especially on the outbound. The men would get angry, and they would piss all over the wall and the toilet handle and toilet seat and the floor. And sometimes people would have explosive diarrhea that would cover the toilet handle. I know that sounds completely crazy that people would do that, but we had some absolute animals that worked there. They would crap on the toilet handle, and they would hit the wall with it. Oh man, I'm just remembering, and it was just crazy. It was terrible bad. At times, it was just terrible bad. The conditions, the floor drains would get clogged up with trash and cardboard dust and mud and nuts and bolts, and they would have to put a secondary screen down there, a mesh screen, to keep things from falling down in the drains and permanently getting trapped in the sewer system under the building. But it wouldn't work 100%. It would only keep the large things out that would clog the pipe. And the building, the trucks themselves often came in and they'd be damaged. There'd be oil leaks, antifreeze leaks, and large drip lines of those fluids, pools of it where the trucks had been parked because a lot of the trucks were not maintained properly or well. Automotive couldn't keep up with the maintenance demand, and the company was cheap. So it often took quite a while for issues with the trucks to get repaired. The drivers would get citations because of that when they would leave the building. Turn signal out, headlights out, taillights out. There was no air conditioning in the building, and there was no heat either in most areas. What else? The PDs, the outbounds, would have recycle drops, and we'd have to manually pull the stuff down off those recycle slides from the second story because it would get stuck. There'd be jams constantly. So we'd have to climb these massive, almost like a metal playground slide, the old galvanized steel they used to use. Massive slides in order to fix the issue of the jam so the packages would flow back to the sort aisle. They would get stuck constantly. And the pens had rows of shop lights, those bar light bulbs, the long ones, and they would flash the lights whenever there was an E-reg coming down on the bottom belt. We would often miss them anyway. It was exhausting because they expected so much from their workers, and we were getting paid so poorly. The bathrooms often had broken mirrors in them. People would get angry and they would pull the soap dispenser or the hand dryer off the wall and throw it on the floor. They would get their crayons and draw on the walls, the doors, the feeder trailer walls, write explicit stuff on there, explicit images, all kinds of stuff. And everywhere you went in the building, things were broken. It was not properly maintained. We'd have parts of the superstructure where they had run E-reg trains into it repeatedly and taken a corner of a solid steel pole and literally ground it to the point that there was a large hole in the corner of it from hitting it with those trains. And we would have to use pallet jacks to gather all the stuff that did not make service at the end of the night and get pallets and fill the pallets up with those items that missed going out on the trucks, because the trucks would leave before all the volume was shipped out. And some nights, on the especially bad nights, we'd have thousands of packages. I mean, like, you wouldn't even believe it. There'd be drivers coming in at 11:30 and 12 o'clock who were supposed to be back the next morning at 8 and 8:30. And the amount of volume that was left, especially during the holidays on the floor, during busy periods like after Black Friday, they would be getting just absolutely destroyed there. It was horrifically bad. And we would have a lot of products that would never make it to their destination. Things would be destroyed constantly. So many consumer goods lost. Things people could not replace that were lost. Precious mementos, family photographs, and all this stuff that was damaged. I've talked about this before. Would end up either getting thrown away without even being processed by Overgoods, or it would end up at Overgoods in piles, along with whatever we could find that was left of the original label. Sometimes we'd find boxes in the building where all that was left were sides of the box or parts of the label. We'd be hunting around, searching the work areas and the PDs and the unload and the floor for basically what was left of packages that had been completely ripped apart and destroyed in the system, or by somebody mishandling them, throwing them, kicking them, dropping them. And some of these packages would get dropped from very high up, 2 or 3 stories off the ground. And on the upper pickoff positions where they were sorting the packages down to the lower drops for the outbound in the PDs 1 through 5, they would have to climb a ladder that was something like 25 to 30 feet tall in order to get up to the sorting position. And every night, at the end of the night, we would have to walk the belts out to make sure that none of the packages got caught in any of the traps within the belts after slipping under the diverter or being forced under the diverter. is often envelopes. Ground envelopes or next day air envelopes would sometimes go down there. And sometimes packages would fall over the diverters that sat at a height of 12 to 18 inches and then get knocked into the trap behind the diverters on the top belt, 2 and 3 stories above the ground. But no matter how much that we complained about conditions in the warehouse, full-time management would waitlist concerns, very significant equipment concerns about things being broken for as much as 18 months in some cases. A set of rollers that cost $5,000 to replace that was falling apart or bent in half from being struck by a train or falling out of the building because trucks were leaving early before the rollers had been pulled out and the drivers weren't verifying that the loads were safe to pull away from the building. They would drop those rollers on the parking lot. I can remember times where I was in a truck and this happened, and the drivers walked back there and they were so pissed off when they found out that the rollers were still hanging out of the load or that they'd fallen out of the parking lot. And sometimes they wouldn't even stop. They would go and they would park in the yard, and then somebody would come out there and just start yelling at them. These drivers who had been there for 20, 30, 40 years. And those feeder trailers made big money moving the stuff between hubs. Those drivers were almost all making peak pay. I mean, 40, 50 bucks an hour, you know, and overtime was even more than that. It was like $50 to $70 an hour. So that was where the real money was at, driving those big rigs with the CDL. But they wouldn't let you do that position. Not just anybody could do it. You had to have so much seniority. Those positions all made very good money. They were all $100,000 driving positions. And it was really difficult to win the bid for those contract positions. I would often come in at the beginning of the shift and I would check the floors. I would get what they called hub snakes, these plastic rings that ran around larger packages off the floor so that they wouldn't snare people and cause them to fall. And I would go out in the yard in a safety vest, usually one that I had bought myself because the ones they had at the hub were stained up with, you know, grease and motor oil. And I would get load retainers. And the load retainers would be used to make sure that the final wall on the trailer did not fall when the loads pulled away from the hub at the end of the night. For setting up the rollers on a PD, which is usually about 7 or 8 doors, they would give me an extra 30 minutes for that, plus going out in the yard and getting load retainers in. I would arrive 30 minutes before the shift started, and they expected me to set up all those doors with each one of these sets being pulled in the truck weighing something like 500 or 600 pounds. Some of them weighed more than that. If it was a long load, it'd be much more, 700, 800 pounds easily. And they would have me do that and then go out in the yard and grab those retainers. And still, even doing that, I was not making anything. It was, on a good week, I was making between 120 and 150 a week take home. But that was including, it was before having to buy work boots that cost between $40 and $150. The steel grates in the building on the elevated surfaces would chew your shoes, your boots up, whatever you wore to work. It would eat holes in the bottom of your shoes within 4 to 6 months because of the sheer amount of walking you're doing. Every night, I would walk between as little as 4 to 5 miles and as much as 13 miles. each night, back and forth in the lows, on the aisle floors, picking up e-regs. My feet would hurt terribly at the end of the night after I was done walking. And I would feel absolutely exhausted. And I didn't know what to do half the time to remedy it, except, soak them in hot water. I'd get home and I'd take a hot shower. And I just put my feet up and just sleep. But the conditions there's nothing to mitigate walkability, to make it a easier surface to walk on. You don't have any kind of mat that you stand on. In the outbound loads, you're walking on aluminum floors, and you're walking on usually wood paneled floors. It's this finished brown wood they've installed it in the trucks in slats. And sometimes the feeder trailers would have large holes in the floor and the ceiling. You had to be careful not to step in those holes because you could fall out or get hurt, trip over it, get hurt. That happened a few times. They would ship people's packages on trucks that had holes in the roof that were leaking water. There'd be rain. I'd get in there, and the feeder trailer had been run into the edge of a building or a low clearance object, and you'd see at the front of the trailer that water was just pouring in through the roof. And I'd have to go and tell management about it. And sometimes they're like, man, they didn't want to use those trucks. But sometimes, since the stuff was already in there, they'd be like, F it. They're just going to have to deal with it at the next location. So the customers' packages would get damaged. Everything in the affected area where the cab, the box on the truck got filled with water, everything on that floor and under that leak would be ruined. Those boxes would just disintegrate. And the same thing applied when customers ordered bleach and the bleach bottles leaked inside the boxes, because bleach completely disintegrates cardboard 100%. I mean, it turns yellow and then it just dissolves like it's not even there. So the bleach would be falling out of those packages, and the other packages would be literally melting. And it was really messy. I always remember more after I make these videos.